4 United States presidents have been assassinated, and all 4 had something in common. Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy were the victimized commanders-in-chief. Conventional wisdom is that Honest Abe angered many Southerners whose economy in large part revolved around the legalization of slavery. And what could Abraham Lincoln's murder have to do with the assassination of James Garfield 17 years later in 1881? Or the shooting death of President William McKinley in 1901? And what could possibly be the common thread that connects all 3 of these historic leaders' killings to the infamous 1963 assassination of John F. Kennedy? After all, Kennedy's murder was nearly 100 years after the Lincoln assassination. The beloved JFK was credited with highly important civil rights advancements helping Black Americans. Could this be the linking motive between his murder and Abraham Lincoln's? Racial tensions, of course, were also raging during the McKinley and Garfield presidencies. Were the perpetrators all fueled by racism? There were also grave matters involving foreign policy that angered many Americans during each of these presidents' terms. Both presidents, McKinley and Garfield, had major international crises brewing right before their assassinations. But also, core to it all is one common thread: money. Our government, so simply, is run on the basis of money. And how and who issues and controls it is as much a founding building block as the First and Fourth Amendments. Mayor Amschel Rothschild of the powerful banking house of Rothschilds and Sons infamously said,
"Give me the power to create a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws."
President Lincoln, President Garfield, President McKinley, and President Kennedy all died for the same reason, and it has something to do with money. There are many odd similarities and eerie facts that join together the Lincoln and Kennedy assassinations. Some are widely known, others are rather obscure. Of course, everyone knows that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and John F. Kennedy was murdered by Lee Harvey Oswald.
John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939. After shooting Lincoln, Booth ran from a theater and was caught in a warehouse. Oswald ran from a warehouse and was caught in a theater. Booth was killed before his trial, and so was Oswald. Abraham Lincoln was first elected to Congress in 1846. John F. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960. Both Lincoln and Kennedy were known for their advocacy of civil rights. Both presidents presided over major wars. Lincoln was president during the Civil War. JFK was president during the Vietnam War. Both presidents were assassinated by Southerners. Both presidents were succeeded by their vice presidents who were Southerners. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy, was born in 1908. Both Andrew Johnson and Lyndon B. Johnson were Democrats. Lincoln's secretary was named Kennedy, and Kennedy's secretary was named Lincoln. Lincoln's secretary warned him not to go to Ford's Theater, and Kennedy's secretary warned him not to go to Dallas. And both Kennedy and Lincoln were killed in the presence of their wives.
Although these similarities are mystifying and maybe scary, they don't explain the reason why these two presidents were murdered, or the reason why Presidents McKinley and Garfield were murdered, as the reason for all four of them was exactly the same. These men didn't just attempt to do something, they actually carried it out. They changed the United States monetary system, and it got them killed. All four of them, by the same method of execution, they were shot to death. Understanding how money is issued and who actually controls it, and how these people and entities today make hundreds of billions of dollars from this system every year, will help to understand the reason why these four men had their presidencies terminated earlier than planned. When you look closely at the money in your wallet or purse, you will notice at the top of each bill the words Federal Reserve Note. But what is the Federal Reserve? Most Americans assume the Federal Reserve banks are part of the government. They are not. The Federal Reserve banks are private corporations, partially owned by foreign interests. These banks and their stockholders control the greater bulk of wealth in America. To better understand the true identity and purpose of these corporations, one must go back to the earliest days of our nation. During the period after the American Revolution, but before the drafting of the Constitution, our founding fathers were approached by representatives of wealthy banking families from Europe. They proposed the establishment of a central bank for use by America. This bank would provide the money that our young country needed to grow into a vibrant nation. However, the founding fathers rejected their proposal. The United States, being a sovereign nation, was fully capable of creating its own money supply. This power, quote, to coin money and regulate the value thereof, end quote, was given to our Congress in the Constitution. Aside from knowing that the United States had the power to create its own currency, the Founding Fathers were well aware of the motives of the bankers, namely to siphon off the wealth and natural resources of the people through various methods of currency manipulation, just as they had done throughout history in every major country in Europe.
I believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies. Bank paper must be suppressed, and the circulating medium must be restored to the nation to whom it belongs.
The primary proponent of a central bank for the early United States was Alexander Hamilton. Sponsored by the international banking conglomerates and wealthy elites, Hamilton convinced the U.S. leadership that this central bank, owned and controlled by his wealthy patrons, would partner with the United States and establish a very profitable banking franchise. Thus, a 20-year charter was granted to the First Bank of the United States in 1792. Over the next 20 years, this central bank issued banknotes against the nation's gold coins. The ever-evolving monetary monster financed and took an ownership interest in nearly every major business endeavor started in the United States. The bankers, most of whom were Europeans, soon convinced the new Congress that the United States should sell their 20% share to the bank. And by 1808, the First Bank of the United States was totally private, and its profits were enormous. This did not escape notice of Congress, who refused to renew their charter in 1811. That same year, however, the nation quickly discovered itself embroiled in conflicts with Great Britain, which led to the War of 1812. The British invaded and sacked Washington, burning the White House and most government buildings. Suffering financial difficulties created by the war, Congress rechartered the bank, and then the British withdrew from U.S. soil. This second Bank of the United States also had a 20-year charter, and by the time it was up for renewal, the president in office was Andrew Jackson. And Jackson, well, he was a fiery man who happened to strongly oppose this central private banking system and paper money overall. Andrew Jackson had gained fame as a general in the United States Army who fearlessly fought his British enemies in the War of 1812. He then served in both houses of Congress, never finding an issue he didn't want to fight. As president, Jackson sought to advance the rights of the common man against a corrupt aristocracy, and the bank was on his hit list to eliminate.
The bold effort the present bank had made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that await the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it.
And kill the bank Andrew Jackson did, by a veto of the bank's new charter, in hopes of extorting a rescue of their privately controlled central bank. Banking moguls and their political henchmen introduced a short-lived financial panic that was initially blamed on Jackson. But the people were all the wiser, with grave concern that a single, centralized private bank had been issuing America's currency instead of the U.S. government. Why should these private bankers profit so vastly when the government itself could issue and control the money supply, Jackson asked. This riled the majority of Americans who were disturbed by the bank's monopoly power to issue money and its political favoritism in granting of loans. The second Bank of the United States had overplayed its hand. It very arrogantly and indiscreetly denied loans to supporters of Andrew Jackson, while bestowing loans to his opponents. By 1834, a general backlash against the central bank's tactics had widely spread, and all recharter efforts were abandoned. At this point, their monopoly power was shattered, and the power to issue money fell to any state-chartered banking institution, and there were many. The second Bank of the United States chieftains, always crafty and highly funded, simply switched gears. In February 1836, this central bank became a private corporation under Pennsylvania Commonwealth law. Still having some power, the centralized bankers utilized it through relationships with numerous individual private banks, and suddenly a contrived shortage of money ensued, causing the Panic of 1837. Everyone, regardless of politics, was affected. This panic lasted approximately 7 years until a system of banking, completely excluding a centralized bank, gained its full footing. And from 1841 through 1857, America lived the greatest economic prosperity it had ever seen. During this period, with no centralized second Bank of the United States involvement whatsoever, federal revenue was solely diverted into smaller, unaffiliated banks by executive order. Never willing to give up on their uber-powerful and mega-wealthy, wealth-creating monster of a business, however, the international centralized bankers fostered a series of purported bank panics to highlight their indispensable role. The Panic of 1857 the Panic of 1873, the Panic of 1884, the Panic of 1893, and the Panic of 1896. There were many naysayers who recognized that these panics were bogus, but a combination of greed and stupidity among the majority of top U.S. government decision makers allowed the centralized bank in one form or another to continually re-emerge. Finally, in 1907, one final alleged banking panic shifted public opinion back in favor of a centralized bank system. The European families, led by the Rothschilds, recognized that finally their chance to take full control of America's banking system had once again arrived. The European bankers began, through the newspapers they owned and lobby groups they funded, to call for full banking reform. They clamored for congressional investigations into the current banking system and offered their expertise in drafting reforms that would protect the public against future bank failures. By 1912, so widespread was public concern over banking reform that presidential candidates from each political party offered their own carefully drafted versions of a national monetary reform bill. What the public had no way of knowing was that the two main competing reform bills were virtually identical, as both were written by the same German banker, Paul Warburg. The public also had no way of knowing that the election campaigns of the three 1912 presidential candidates were financed by Warburg's firm, Kuhn Loeb and Company, one of the wealthiest and oldest banking houses of Europe. By controlling not only the content of the banking reform bill, but also the results of the 1912 presidential election, the foreign banking interests were guaranteed that their dream of establishing a new permanent central bank for America would finally be realized. This allowed for their complete control over America's money, as they once had with the first and second banks of the United States. In 1913, the Warburg Central Bank Plan, intentionally mischaracterized as the Federal Reserve Act, was signed into law by newly elected President Woodrow Wilson. This bill officially transferred Congress's constitutional duty to issue America's money into the hands of a private cartel, the Federal Reserve Banks. Stock in these private corporations was not made available to the public and was purchased only by the bank's leadership, who, of course, were the powerful international banking families. At its inception, the activities of the Federal Reserve Banks were intended to be monitored by the President and Congress. However, over the years, through repeated subtle changes in legislation, the operations of these corporations have become completely independent of all congressional control. Extremely secretive in its operation, these corporations even refuse to be fully audited by the United States government, with minimal congressional opposition, as both mainstream political parties receive the majority of their funding through these internationally owned banks. To understand how the Federal Reserve Banks have successfully converted the U.S. from the world's largest creditor in 1913 to the world's biggest debtor today, it is only necessary to examine the procedure that these corporations employ to create our currency. When the management of the Federal Reserve Banks proclaimed that $1 billion should be issued for use by the American people, they simply create $1 billion and lend it into the banking system. By doing so, new money enters circulation, as the Federal Reserve Banks, the creators of money, are not required to have any actual funds of their own. With this money, they simply purchase $1 billion worth of U.S. Treasury debt from its member banks. The banks now have $1 billion new dollars in their accounts, which they will then loan into the economy at high interest. Is it any wonder then that the bankers were so persistent in their efforts to be granted the right to issue America's currency? When the Federal Reserve banks take possession of U.S. Treasury debt, they also take possession and control of the real wealth of America, as it is the hard labor and property of millions of citizens transferred into the Treasury through taxes that backs up the actual worth of this Treasury debt. Each time these private corporations, called the Federal Reserve banks, purchase $1 billion in debt, $1 billion worth of American labor and property must eventually be confiscated by the Treasury to cover the new debt. It may now be obvious why Thomas Jefferson so vehemently fought the issuance of America's currency by a private bank. To add to the oppressive nature of our current money system, the Federal Reserve Bank will collect annual interest on the Treasury debt it holds, further adding to the indebtedness of the American citizens to the Treasury and thus the Federal Reserve banks. One sometimes hears the term debt money used to describe the notes issued by the Federal Reserve. Under our present system of money creation, it is a sad fact that each dollar note issued by this corporation places $1 worth of debt onto the backs of the American population. The effect of the Federal Reserve banks on our nation and its citizens has been devastating. Since 1913, the value of the American dollar has fallen to 11 cents. Our gold reserves have lost all correlation to money in circulation. Interest rates rise and fall arbitrarily, and a continually inflated money supply wipes out the value of lifelong savings. And soon enough, interest payments on the national debt will exceed all revenue collected annually by the Treasury. It's frightening that not 1 in 100,000 Americans would be able to guess the identity of the actual group responsible for these tragic statistics. The culprit is the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve notes in our wallets and purses are not constitutional money. They are, in fact, pieces of paper which document America's ever-growing debt to the very clever, very persistent, and very wealthy stockholders of the Federal Reserve banks. As President Woodrow Wilson said in that most important year of 1913,
"We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and the duress of small groups of dominant men."
what got Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and Kennedy assassinated wasn't just usual matters of money and greed. No, it was much more. It was that they were tampering with the most powerful players in the U.S. monetary system, the international centralized private banks who took over issuing America's money instead of the U.S. Treasury. Now, each of these presidents was killed by a lone gunman, right? Or wrong? Well, let's take a look at what each assassinated president did one by one and who may have killed them. Four months into his presidency, James A. Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. But who was Charles Guiteau? He could best be described as an intellectual drifter who failed at many professional endeavors. Yet he craved praise for his botched undertakings. Guiteau developed some sort of law practice. He tried his hand in bill collections. He doted on God with a stab at theology. He even journeyed with John Humphrey Noyes' perfectionist religious commune, the Oneida Community. A cult-like group, this community believed that Jesus had already made his second coming back in 70 AD. Through this theory, the Oneidas believed that they could live perfectly, free of sin, and live in a heaven on earth. If Jesus had already returned, then the millennial kingdom was here for them to realize. The Oneida community practiced communalism and mutual criticism. The latter meant that at weekly group meetings, everyone could criticize each other without repercussions. According to the group's leader, John Noyes, this was designed to eliminate undesirable character traits. Or perhaps it was a component of a communalism society where not only possessions and property were shared, but thoughts too. Like a venue for shaping minds, where all share equally in the thought, property, and money pie. Sound familiar? Maybe like socialism and communism? After spending 5 years with the Oneida community, could Charles Guiteau have been a socialist and communist sympathizer? Does that type of assassin sound familiar? Like one Lee Harvey Oswald? But why would a socialist-minded type person want to assassinate James Garfield? Or John F. Kennedy, for that matter? Perhaps this could have something to do with money. Because isn't the basis of socialism and communism one thing? Money? Just like it is with any form of economy. President Garfield was a tried and true capitalist. He saw the economy as a moral issue, and that everyone should have the ability to obtain the American dream. The only real way to succeed in that dream is through capitalism, of course. History has proven that every socialist society has turned into communism, which means that about 1% of the society is uber wealthy, with the rest being super poor. There is no middle class in communist countries, nor in socialist economies. Accordingly, communism and socialism, well, stink. That's what President Garfield thought, at least. But not Charles Guiteau. Oh, by the way, James Garfield wanted the U.S. to return to the gold standard. Would this upset a socialist? Let's try to put it all together. The United States government's story is that Guiteau fired a bullet into Garfield because he was enraged that the president didn't appoint him to an ambassador post. You see, Guiteau had written a speech in favor of Garfield's candidacy. According to official historical accounts, Guiteau believed that this speech was integral, if not the deciding factor, in leading to Garfield's victory over his Democrat opponent, Winfield Hancock. Unfortunately for Guiteau, no one else thought that. His speech, entitled Garfield versus Hancock, was originally called Grant versus Hancock. That's because Guiteau first believed that Ulysses S. Grant would win the Republican nomination in the 1880 presidential election. When Grant lost the nomination to Garfield, Guiteau changed the title of his speech to Garfield versus Hancock. With speech in hand, Guiteau seemingly joined the Garfield campaign. However, he never publicly read the speech, and he only distributed a few hundred written copies. The speech was criticized because it was replete with references to Grant's policies, which weren't necessarily promulgated by Garfield. In a rush to switch the speech to pertain to Garfield, Guiteau apparently was careless, and it read more like a stump speech for Grant. The general consensus is that his speech was wholly ineffective and had no bearing whatsoever on Garfield's campaign. Still, most historians proclaim that Guiteau was delusional and believed that his Garfield versus Hancock speech was the linchpin to Garfield's win. And after the election, Guiteau sought to be appointed ambassador of Vienna. It is reported that he bounced from Republican event to Republican event, lobbying for this post and citing his speech as the basis for the appointment. He visited the White House, even dropping off a copy of his speech to the newly elected Garfield. And for the next few months, he bantered back and forth between the State Department and the White House, fervently advocating his ambassadorship cause to cabinet members and whoever else in the power hierarchy he could reach. Finally, Mr. Guiteau advised that he would settle for a diplomatic post in Paris. He wasn't gaining much traction, however. Guiteau had been staying in varied D.C. area boarding houses, allegedly beating his bills and rarely changing his clothes. The government says he was becoming more and more desperate and crazed to earn his appointment. And after being banned from the White House, he approached Secretary of State James G. Blaine, who reportedly told him,
"Never speak to me again of the Paris consulship as long as you live."
Run-of-the-mill historical accounts provide that the sum total of this Garfield administration rebuke resulted in Guiteau electing to assassinate the president. More so, it is said that Guiteau declared that a higher power commanded him to kill President Garfield and that he stated,
"I leave my justification to God."
God's command and justification for the shooting, of course, was rooted in Garfield's lack of gratitude for Guiteau's speech until his decision to not appoint Guiteau to one of the diplomatic positions. Now, would God do that? Would a crazy person even think that God would issue such an order? Maybe. But maybe there was something more to this. Do you know what else James A. Garfield pushed extremely hard for? A hint. It was something that the first assassinated president was known for: civil rights for Black Americans. While Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves as U.S. president, James Garfield was one of his loyal soldiers in the U.S. Congress. Garfield was a staunch abolitionist prior to the Civil War, and he became a brigadier general at only 31 years old, successfully leading the Union troops against the Confederates in a famous battle at Middle Creek, Kentucky. After Lincoln's assassination, Garfield became one of the strongest voices in Congress in favor of civil rights for not only the newly freed slaves, but for all blacks across America. He was a proponent of increased black education, and he actually called for black suffrage rights. Now, there was a direct connection between Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield. Both men were opposed to slavery. But was this civil rights unity something that would have caused either of their assassins to pull the trigger? After all, this was the most divisive issue of their time. Of course, we all know that Lincoln's murderer, John Wilkes Booth, was an ardent Confederate sympathizer who hated Lincoln for making slavery illegal in the southern states. But there is no evidence that Charles Guiteau was influenced by this matter or that he was even concerned with the civil rights movement at all. There is evidence, though, that both Guiteau and Booth were angry at their then respective presidents. The government's historical accounts present different reasons for their presidential rage. However, at their respective times, their disdain was no secret, and when anger is revealed, sometimes it can be seized upon. There is known substantial evidence which shows that both John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, JFK's killer, were recruited and used as patsies by other higher powers to commit their assassinations. May the same be true with Charles Guiteau? Was there a conspiracy to murder James Garfield? And if so, was Charles Guiteau recruited to be the trigger man because of his well-known hatred for Garfield? And because it was also well known that he was clinically insane? Or could Charles Guiteau have been completely rational? And could his socialist ideology have been the core motive for the shooting? Either way, an insane man with a motive, or a cult-like ideologue with a motive, makes for a good choice to conscript into an assassination plot. But who would want to enlist Guiteau? And what would be these persons' motives to murder a president? James Garfield actively opposed cooperative farm programs such as those supported by the Grange, an agrarian organization. Recall who else employed communal property programs? Yes, the Oneida community, which Guiteau was a longtime member of. Garfield also opposed labor unions, mandatory maximum 8-hour workdays, and federally funded relief welfare-type projects. Yes, James Garfield was not a big government guy. He was the furthest thing from a socialist. He was known for saying that these liberal, cooperative, and labor policies equated to communism in disguise. And also remember this, James Garfield was an outspoken advocate of the gold standard. Arguments among congressmen raged between those who wanted all U.S. money to be backed by gold versus those who demanded that paper currency be issued, along with silver being coined in greater quantities. These greenbackers and silverites opined that such a monetary system would aid in debt relief, especially for distressed farmers. Garfield rebuked them, instead promoting hard money policies backed by gold. Before being elected to the presidency, Garfield was the chairman of Congress's Banking and Currency Committee. He was also a key member of the House Ways and Means Committee. There, he strongly backed the hard money, gold standard initiatives, and he was a major proponent of the U.S. government issuing its own money instead of the private centralized banks. By fighting against the issuance of paper currency not supported by gold, as well as advocating for the use of greenback dollars issued under Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, Garfield became a target of those in favor of soft money policies. While his hard money stance made him popular with many gold bug Republicans who wanted to thwart the country's ever-expanding money supply, it certainly infuriated many of those higher powers in the private banking industry. And that's because they stood to make billions of dollars in the late 19th century by controlling and issuing the U.S. currency. During his campaign, Garfield had a lot of opposition from the stalwarts faction of his Republican Party. This group were allied with the deep state power of the international banking chieftains. The stalwarts pushed for Chester A. Arthur to be Garfield's running mate. To mend fences and maintain party cohesion, Garfield agreed, and Arthur became his vice president. It's interesting to note that as Charles Guiteau was being wrestled to the ground after shooting Garfield, he screamed,
I am a stalwart of the stalwarts, and Arthur will be president.
No doubt Chester A. Arthur did become president upon Garfield dying from his gunshot wounds. Did the stalwarts and their centralized banking industry bosses conspire with Charles Guiteau to murder James Garfield because he wanted to take enormous power and wealth away from them? Because he didn't want these bank moguls to issue paper money and coin silver? Because he was a presidential voice for the gold standard? And because he wanted the U.S. government, on behalf of the people, to issue its own money and not international private bankers? Because in that scenario, Garfield was literally stripping billions of dollars from these private banks. Could this greed and power have been the true reason for President Garfield's fatal demise? The centralized banks are quite adverse to credit-based fiat money delivered directly into circulation by the federal government. This type of money assists people in escaping debt slavery, as it does not come with interest strings attached. Garfield had plans for the U.S. Treasury, and not the centralized private banks, to issue dollars directly into the U.S. economy, following in the footsteps of his mentor, Abraham Lincoln, who did just that to finance the Civil War. Unfortunately, Garfield also followed Lincoln's footsteps into an untimely, unfinished presidential term that ended in a graveyard. During his inaugural speech, President Garfield said,
Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce.
Garfield had wanted the U.S. Treasury the people of the United States to have this control, and not some foreign private bankers. Officials would have you believe that James Garfield's assassination was carried out by a lone nut wrought with wrath over a lack of a political appointment, that it was an act perpetrated by this one singular insane man. But it appears there were indeed others who were involved in James Garfield's assassination. Men who cared a whole lot about the United States monetary system and about who controlled it. James Garfield's quest to reinstitute the gold standard and have currency issued directly by the U.S. government greatly angered these men. The same as Charles Guiteau was greatly enraged by Garfield's failure to grant his desired political appointment and/or Garfield's gold standard capitalism ideology. Putting this together renders one likely outcome, that these higher human powers, and not godly powers, recruited Guiteau and used him as their gunman fall guy. A bizarre, tragic footnote to James Garfield's assassination was that he did not die immediately from the gunshot wound inflicted by Guiteau. He actually passed away 2.5 months later, on September 19, 1881. Many medical experts and historians argue that Garfield would have survived the shooting, and that severely botched treatment by his doctors was the true proximate cause of his death. Unsanitary medical instruments were used to treat the president immediately after the attack. In the weeks that followed, many other unsterilized probing fingers and devices were inserted into Garfield's body searching for the bullet. Even though newer medical technology for the treatment of gunshot wounds had emerged by 1881, Garfield's doctors were old school and were adamant about their methods. The combination of this outdated treatment with the constant unsanitary conditions caused Garfield to suffer gravely as he spiraled towards death. Infections caused blood poisoning and his inability to intake and digest any food. The president lost nearly 100 pounds before he died and ultimately succumbed to heart failure. Could his medical doctors have been engaged in a further plot to kill Garfield once it was learned that Guiteau's bullet didn't complete the job? That would seem rather unlikely, as it appears that he was just the victim of good old-fashioned medical malpractice. What is extremely likely, however, is that the fired bullet was at the fingertip of Charles Guiteau, connected to the arms of the very concerned and very angry centralized banking cartel. The same banking cartel that was equally worried and infuriated just 16 years earlier when Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth.
Action.
President Lincoln had asked the private bankers for a loan to finance the Civil War, and was quoted rates ranging from 24 to 36% interest. In a November 21, 1862 letter from Lincoln to his friend William Elkin, the president declared,
The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, but it is the government's greatest creative opportunity. By the adoption of these principles, the long-felt want for a uniform medium will be satisfied. The taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest, discounts, and exchanges. The financing of all public enterprises, the maintenance of stable government and ordered progress, and the conduct of the Treasury will become matters of practical administration. The people can and will be furnished with a currency as safe as their own government. Money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity. democracy will rise superior to the money power.
So, Honest Abe rebuked the big centralized banking cartels and decided that the U.S. government would issue and control its own money. President Lincoln then asked Congress to pass a law authorizing the printing of full legal tender Treasury notes to pay for the war effort. This law authorized the printing of $450 million worth of greenbacks and interest-free money to finance the war, which deprived the centralized bankers of millions in interest. It acted as legal tender for all debts, public and private. It paid for soldiers and sailors and necessary war supplies. Lincoln realized the benefit to the Republic in a letter to Edward Taylor in December 1862 when he wrote,
"We gave the people of this republic the greatest blessing they have ever had, their own paper money to pay their own debts."
In July of 1861, Congress authorized the multi-millions of dollars in demand notes. They bore no interest and could be redeemed for specie on demand. They were not legal tender, but like Treasury notes, could be used to pay customs duties. These demand notes were printed in green ink on the reverse side, hence their nickname, greenbacks. As they were fully redeemable in gold, they traded at par. Remember who else supported the gold standard and government-issued money? President Garfield. And guess who else supported government-issued money? William McKinley and John F. Kennedy. Things, of course, didn't turn out well for any of these presidents after they initiated their new and bank-damaging monetary systems. More so, immediately after their deaths, massive money-issuing power went directly back into the greedy hands of the centralized bankers. Upon Abraham Lincoln's assassination, all of his U.S. Treasury-issued greenbacks were retired from circulation, leaving only national banknotes. But what were national banknotes in the 1860s? And why and how did they come into existence? Because the 1860s Congress was so influenced by the centralized banking cartel, they would not grant Lincoln's greenback legislation without a parallel system where the private banks simultaneously issued money. Thus, Congress enacted the National Banking Act, which established a system of national banks and created a national currency maintained by private bank holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. This resulted in a dual money-issuing system being born, which encompassed both the national banknotes and Lincoln's greenbacks. This, of course, greatly benefited the international bankers who sought to again control the issuing of America's currency. The newly enacted twofold monetary system, initiated out of necessity by Abraham Lincoln to fund the Civil War, became the creature from Jekyll Island, as it not only was the perfect setup for the bankers, but it also very likely led to Lincoln's death. The leading demon of this mid-1800s banking cartel, Rothschilds and Sons, seized the moment, even publicly stating their plans well in advance of the 1863 Banking Act. At the marriage of Nathan Rothschild's eldest daughter in 1857, he said,
"I shall divide the United States in half. Half for you, Lionel, and half for you, James."
Curiously enough, the Civil War was created in just this fashion. Half with one Rothschild brother financially supporting the North, and half with the other Rothschild brother supporting the South, and the winner forced the loser to pay his debts. So no matter who won the war, the Rothschilds and their banking cartel won over the U.S. monetary system. Since Lincoln's greenbacks were immediately retired after his death, the only currency left were the national banknotes issued by these private bankers. From this foothold grew the forerunner of the Federal Reserve System, the modern, centralized banking cartel that controls the issuing of all American currency. After learning the much less known circumstances surrounding James Garfield's killing, it makes the very likely true reason for Lincoln's murder much more understandable. On the assassin side, Charles Guiteau certainly had his own economic motivations to murder President Garfield, and he also presents as the perfect patsy used to carry out the deadly deed. Well, how about John Wilkes Booth? The government's explanation for the Lincoln assassination is well known. A famous actor, John Wilkes Booth, and a few other disgruntled Southerners of no notoriety got together and plotted to kill the president. This group have been portrayed as racist Confederate patriots whose motivation to kill Lincoln was one of pure revenge for the president's refusal to allow the Southern secession and his freedom of the slaves. This was indeed the one presidential assassination where even the government admits that it wasn't just a lone gunman. However, the conspiracy, our officials say, only goes so far. It was more or less a case of just personal political animosity with no powerful brokers connected to the murder. Or was it actually more than that? Many theories have abounded. A logical one is that Booth and his cohorts were part of a larger, grandiose Confederate plot which involved top Confederate leaders. Certainly, there was considerable talk and some planning by Confederate chieftains to eliminate Lincoln many times during and after the Civil War. There also is evidence that Booth may have been in dialogue with some of them. Specially coded letters were found in Booth's belongings at the National Hotel, which linked him to the Confederacy. One of Booth's co-conspirators, George Atzerodt, stated before his trial that Booth had knowledge of an unsuccessful Confederate plan to blow up the White House, and Booth's original design to kidnap Lincoln, as opposed to murdering him, has been tied to Confederate leadership involvement. However, there is no demonstrable evidence to firmly bound men like Jefferson Davis or Stonewall Jackson into Booth's plans. Surely, the Confederate bosses had a motive to kill Lincoln, but there were motives with strong proofs that supersede even theirs. You have often heard theories that Lyndon B. Johnson was behind the Kennedy assassination, that JFK's vice president was the mastermind. Well, many people have conjectured that the other Johnson VP was the brains behind Abraham Lincoln's planned death. You see, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's second in command, knew John Wilkes Booth. And they weren't just acquaintances, according to many historians. They say that when Johnson was the governor of Tennessee, he and Booth kept a pair of sisters as mistresses. During a lot of drinking and frolicking together, could Johnson and Booth have hatched the plot to kill Mr. Lincoln? The president's wife thought so. In an 1866 letter to her friend Sally Orne, Mary Todd Lincoln wrote,
That miserable inebriate Johnson had cognizance of my husband's death. Why was that card of Booth's found in his box? Some acquaintance certainly existed. I have been deeply impressed with the harrowing thought that he had an understanding with the conspirators, and they knew their man. As sure as you and I live, Johnson had some hand in all this.
Were Mrs. Lincoln's thoughts those of a distraught, paranoid wife, or were they the product of some credible evidence? It's a fact that just hours prior to firing a bullet into Lincoln's head at the Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth made a stop at the Washington Hotel. Why is that significant? Because Vice President Andrew Johnson lived at the Washington Hotel. More so, Booth left a note with the hotel clerk for Johnson and his private secretary, William A. Browning. The note simply said,
"Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home? J. Wilkes Booth."
William Browning later testified before a military court, stating that he found the note in his box that same afternoon. Was John Wilkes Booth popping by just to say hello to Vice President Johnson on the day of Abraham Lincoln's assassination? Or was he there to kill Johnson first? That would seem rather unlikely, given that his visit to Johnson's hotel was about 7 hours before he shot Lincoln. If he attempted to kill Johnson that far in advance, he definitely would not have been able to find an unprotected President Lincoln watching a play at Ford's Theater. If Lincoln's VP had been shot, Lincoln would have been scuttled away to military protected safety. So perhaps, as Mary Todd Lincoln thought, Booth was visiting Johnson with regard to their upcoming plot to kill the president later that day. The First Lady wasn't the only person in Washington to think this. Many members of Congress also conjectured that Johnson was the ringleader of Lincoln's assassination conspiracy, and they pointed to Booth's hotel visit as proof of it. If Vice President Johnson was involved, the question is, why? Was it just so that he could assume to the highest political position in the land? Was it because he was a Southerner and was opposed to the freeing of slaves? Or did his Southern roots and relationships provide more of an economic reason to see Lincoln dethroned? Remember this: soon after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, all of his U.S. Treasury issued greenbacks were retired from circulation, leaving only national banknotes. This rendered a very critical and powerful result: that only private banks now controlled the issuing of America's money. And under whose command did this occur? One Andrew Johnson. So did Andrew Johnson, at the behest of the very powerful private centralized bankers, orchestrate the assassination of Abraham Lincoln? And did Johnson recruit his pleasure buddy, John Wilkes Booth, to be the triggerman patsy? A man of staunch Southern ideas who was angry about Lincoln's Civil War victory, Booth was a prime choice to be a figurehead in a conspiracy. He was an individual of sizable influence himself, serving as an 1860s Hollywood type. Booth's charismatic ability to recruit other players in the murder plot would be key, and these other players would identify him as the ringleader. A smart cartel-like plot would have the bank moguls speaking directly to Johnson, with Johnson speaking only to Booth, and Booth speaking to the others who helped carry out the deed. Under these circumstances, the vice president would be far removed from the street criminals executing the plot, and the bankers would be even further away from this sinister act. Here, the perfect marriage would have been in place: Booth and his street gang, as a bunch of Southern ideologues in their minds, gained hero status by righteously killing a man who stole away the livelihood and lifestyles of half of America. Andrew Johnson ascends to the presidency, and the international private bankers, well, by gaining full control of the monetary system, they earn billions of dollars forever on. Just kill Abraham Lincoln, which makes Andrew Johnson president, and have Johnson retire the greenbacks, which means only national banknotes are issued. Here, the private banks control the issuance of all U.S. currency. It doesn't get any more powerful than that. Wouldn't it be quite rational to conclude that this was why Abraham Lincoln was assassinated? As Mayor Amschel Rothschild said,
"Give me the power to create a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws."
since Lincoln wasn't giving the bankers the full power to create this nation's money, Andrew Johnson was a much better choice. So maybe Rothschild cared just a bit who was making America's laws. It appears quite likely that both Abraham Lincoln and his friend James Garfield were murdered for the same motive, and with a similar modus operandi in using patsies. No doubt, this tradition carried on with the assassinations of William McKinley and John F. Kennedy. The conventional wisdom is that President McKinley's assassination was the work of a lone gunman, Leon Czolgosz, an avowed socialist like Garfield's gunman Charles Guiteau and Kennedy's shooter Lee Harvey Oswald. Leon Czolgosz was livid by what he called a corrupt U.S. government. Well, this indeed was the story put out by the United States government in 1901, the year McKinley was killed. But perhaps this president's death was the result of the more logical and clear reason that he had instituted what Lincoln and Garfield had done years before him in taking away money issuing control from private, centralized bankers. William McKinley had successfully led a U.S. victory in the Spanish-American War, which led to an easy win for a second term as president. But on September 6, 1901, less than a year after his re-election, McKinley was shot in the abdomen at the Temple of Music in Buffalo, New York. The shooter, Leon Czolgosz, waited on a long line to shake the president's hand. When he finally reached his commander-in-chief, Czolgosz's right hand was draped in a white handkerchief. As McKinley reached out to greet the man, Czolgosz fired 2 bullets. One harmlessly bounced off McKinley's chest bone, but the other lodged in his gut. The president fell to the ground thinking about 2 people, his wife and the man who just shot him. McKinley notably said,
Be careful how you tell her. Oh, be careful.
And as for his assassin, he uttered,
Be easy with them, boys.
Like James A. Garfield, William McKinley did not die quickly from his bullet wounds. Also, like Garfield, failures by the treating physicians contributed to his ultimate demise. You've all heard of the magic bullet in the Kennedy assassination? Well, the McKinley assassination led to the coining of the phrase, the mystery bullet. This is because doctors spent over 90 minutes looking for the bullet during the president's autopsy, but it was never found. Doctors, media, and political leaders were so perplexed by McKinley's quick and unexpected decline that many opined that the bullet must have been poisoned. More so, the question was asked, where the hell was the mystery bullet? And perhaps it might be a smarter question to ask if McKinley was poisoned after he was shot. Not from a poisoned bullet, but by someone simply poisoning him. Were the doctors part of a conspiracy? Brought in to finish off an uncompleted job? You recall what happened to James Garfield. Mainstream history outright blames botched medical care for the proximate cause of his death. If the killers were successful once before in eliminating a president after a non-lethal shooting, why not try the same coffin-insuring method again? Bring in the dirty doctors. Those who infect their presidential patients with unsanitary probing fingers, non-sterile instruments, and unclean conditions follow this by failing to remove a mystery bullet. Or maybe, quite the opposite, locating the bullet, taking it out, and acting like it's still there to justify a certain type of supposedly cautious treatment. A treatment that allows gangrene to develop and kill. Whatever the exact details, we know that both President Garfield and President McKinley died quite some time after their shooting. We also know that they died from infections and blood poisoning. It's hard to believe that 2 presidents, people surely in line for the greatest of medical care, apparently got the worst. Was this just coincidental bad luck? Or were the doctors hired hands, brought in to suture an unfinished assassination? Or perhaps the physicians provided fine medical treatment and someone else with access to the president poisoned their blood. No matter. These 2 men could have survived their shootings, but mysteriously died with poisoned blood. Just like we revealed in the murder of James Garfield and the famous assassinations of Lincoln and Kennedy, the lone gunman theory in William McKinley's case is wholly unbelievable. Everyone knows that John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald had personal motives to kill Honest Abe and JFK, we clearly identified Charles Guiteau's intimate reason to eliminate Garfield. Did Leon Charles Goals also have a private rationale for his carnage upon William McKinley? Yes, he did. Leon Charles Goes was punched, kicked, and stomped by police and bystanders after he shot McKinley. Thereafter, he provided a full confession to authorities. In fact, he presented them with a written letter that outlined his premeditated actions. Charles Goes referred to himself as Fred Niemann, which in German means Fred Nobody. You see, Charles Goes was a total zero, poor, unemployed, unskilled, and alone. He was searching for a voice, the government says. He wanted to become someone and be known as smart and brave. In his written confession, he proudly stated,
I made my plans 3 or 4 days ago to shoot the president. When I shot him, I intended to kill him. And the reason for my intention in killing was because I did not believe in presidents over us. I was willing to sacrifice myself and the president for the benefit of the country. I felt I had more courage than the average man in killing the president and was willing to put my own life at stake in order to do it.
He also wrote about meetings he attended with the anarchists, a burgeoning political group that impelled his shooting. Charles Goes decried,
I heard people talk about the duty they were under to educate the people against the present form of government, and they should do all they could to change the form of government.
But who were the anarchists? Many historians consider that the first global terrorists were the anarchists. These were a loosely knit group of men in both America and Europe who believed in the isolation of the individual. They were advocates of free thought, which included freedom from religion and politics. Anarchism in the 1890s was all about the pursuit of man's right to his own tools, mind, and body. He shall keep the products of his own labor without government interference. This anti-political philosophy from time to time, both in America and abroad, manifested itself into a dynamite bombing or a shooting spree. In the United States, authorities believed, and newspapers reported, that a large swath of the anarchists were foreigners who had immigrated to America. Whether this is true or not is another story. Also, just a story, were most of the terrorist acts attributed to anarchists. There were numerous media reports of explosions, bomb blastings, and even viral plagues that never existed. Alternatively, many who committed terrorist acts called themselves anarchists, but really weren't. And many other attacks were deemed carried out by the anarchists. But the perpetrators really had nothing to do with this free-thinking group. The phony accounts were the norm rather than the exception. The government and its media allies used the alleged anarchist terrorism as a fear-baiting tool to control its populace and to sell newspapers. Thus, fake news had its roots with anarchism in addition to modern-day terrorism. And was Leon Charles Goes actually an anarchist? In the 1890s, there was no shortage of young men who were screaming for attention and longing to do daring things. Leon Charles Goes was one of them. And the anarchists, with all of their media-driven fanfare, was a logical outlet to turn Mr. Nobody into Mr. Somebody. In his quest for recognition, Charles Goes did indeed attend some anarchist meetings in Chicago during the year prior to the McKinley assassination. But after the president's shooting, the anarchists did everything they could to distance themselves from Charles Goes. Could some group more powerful than the sensationalized anarchists have learned of Charles Goes through this publicity and sought out this disaffected, rejected young man and seized upon his yearning to transform from a zero to a hero? Was William McKinley's assassination really the work of a loser, lone gunman with anarchist influences? This government-spewed theory is troubled at its core with the revelation of Charles Goes' true tenuous anarchist ties and the group's very public disassociation with him, not to mention the fake news pandemic that was metastasizing during these times. A more realistic explanation for McKinley's assassination is that it was carried out via a devious plot, which incorporated Leon Czolgosz as its patsy. As a fact, we do know that Czolgosz's bullets didn't execute the fatal damage. It took some medical malpractice or another method of blood poisoning to complete the exterminating task. But who was behind this presidential murder if it wasn't just Leon Czolgosz wanting to become Fred somebody? Who had a motive to kill the US president in 1901? And who could get away with it unscathed? Who could manipulate the media into portraying it as an anarchist act and get it all swept under the carpet before anyone could learn the truth behind this executive treachery? Well, let's look at William McKinley's political history and his presidential goals, and who had the most to gain by eliminating him. After doing battle in the Civil War, William McKinley began his political career as an American isolationist. Not in the sense of the anarchist, of course, no. He sought, like many leaders of the time, to keep America, as much as possible, economically independent from the rest of the world. He was a great proponent of high tariffs on foreign products. As a Republican protectionist, McKinley understood that substantial tariffs prevented the importation of many international goods because it made doing business in the U.S. too expensive for many foreigners. Another benefit of the high tariffs was that it generated significant revenue for the government, thus downsizing the need to rely upon American citizens' hard-earned money to pay for the government's expenses. In other words, it limited the need for income taxes. A natural result was that American-made products had much less competition at home, which allowed them to be sold for greater prices. The higher profits for American industry permitted higher wages for American workers. Did these protectionist plans get McKinley killed by angry agents of foreign nations? No, not at all. McKinley's high tariff agenda persisted during his tenure in Congress and as Ohio's governor. It all ended when he became president in 1896. President McKinley was thrown a curveball when he reluctantly entered the United States into the Spanish-American War in 1898. Upon the war's quick conclusion in America's favor, to the victors went the spoils, and America gained several territories from Spain, including Puerto Rico, Wake, Guam, and the Philippines. The U.S. also annexed the Hawaiian Islands that summer. American businessmen were now much more excited about the prospect of overseas trade, and thus William McKinley was reborn as a free trader. On September 5th, 1901, the day before he was assassinated, William McKinley delivered a speech to 50,000 people in New York proclaiming,
Isolation is no longer possible or desirable. The period of exclusiveness is past. The expansion of our trade and commerce is the pressing problem. Commercial wars are unprofitable. A policy of goodwill and friendly trade relations will prevent reprisals.
Was William McKinley's reversal on trade and what it meant to the private banks the true cause of his mortal demise? In March 1900, the Gold Standard Act of the United States was signed by William McKinley. This declared gold as the only standard for redeeming paper money, and it was a knife in the gut to the international centralized banks who had been in and out of America's money issuing control for the previous 100 years. Under this act, United States notes became redeemable for gold at the then historic rate of $20.67 per ounce. This bolstered U.S. notes' credibility as money, and it substantially injured the strength of private banknotes, thus greatly diminishing international bankers' profits. having just endured one of the centralized bankers' contrived panics, the Panic of 1893, the president was adamant about the gold standard, and he threatened full enforcement. So it wasn't directly McKinley's trade policy that threatened these banks. It was the institution of the gold standard. Further enraging the international bankers, McKinley sent negotiators to Europe to attempt a silver agreement with France and Great Britain. This would have made large sums of silver money available in the cash-starved U.S. McKinley, no doubt, had become enemy number one to these powerful banks. The Gold Standard Act declared that
the gold dollar shall be the standard unit of value, and all forms of money issued or coined by the United States shall be maintained at a parity of value with this standard.
banknotes, U.S. notes, and all other forms of money had to conform to this standard. No longer free to value different forms of money as they saw fit, the international bankers were constrained from issuing paper money that couldn't be redeemed in gold. The gold standard ensured that the money supply, and hence the price level, would remain relatively constant, which of course was a complete financial disaster for the international centralized bankers. But this all changed with the assassination of William McKinley. For the gold standard to work, banks were supposed to play by the rules of the game. They were supposed to raise rates to encourage gold inflow, and to lower their rates to create a gold outflow. The centralized bankers wanted to do neither, and that's simply because these gold standard rules took money issuing control away from them and caused them massive monetary losses. Very quickly after President McKinley's 1901 assassination, his successor, the very famous and loved Theodore Roosevelt, vastly limited the effect of the Gold Standard Act, and the international bankers were back in much better business. Even more so, this initiated the meteoric rise and creation of the Federal Reserve System. With a motive of all motives in place, these bankers just needed what was necessary in the two prior presidential assassinations: a patsy, and wouldn't Leon Charles, with his anarchist ties and his internal need to become a somebody, be the perfect choice? So perhaps common sense, coupled with an extraordinary motive and a lot of history, makes it quite possible that Leon Charles did not act alone, and that instead he was a recruited patsy for the international bankers who needed William McKinley and his Gold Standard Act out of the way. One added interesting note about the McKinley assassination: Leon Charles was tried within a week of his shooting, convicted the very next day, and executed in under a month. That was almost as quick a path to rid the world of JFK's alleged lone assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. As we all know, Oswald was gunned down at the Dallas Police Department just 2 days after he murdered John Kennedy. Nice and tidy, get rid of the killers before they can speak about any accomplices. You know the phrase, where there's smoke, there's fire. 3 presidents, Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, and William McKinley, instituted major upheavals in the U.S. monetary system. Specifically, they took power of issuing America's money away from the centralized private banking cartels and gave it to the U.S. Treasury, to the people. And then these 3 presidents ended up dead. But like I said, where there's smoke, there's fire. And another gun was fired that killed yet another president, a very famous one, John F. Kennedy. This man didn't just upset Richard Nixon in a presidential race, or communist Cuba with the Bay of Pigs. No, he did upset Federal Reserve banks. Since their insidious inception in 1913, no U.S. president had ever dared to upset their trillion-dollar cartel enterprise. Kennedy, however, took them on. But how often have you heard about this? What everyone has heard about, almost ad nauseum, are endless debates about how Lee Harvey Oswald could have assassinated JFK on his own. Was Oswald a good enough marksman? Could he have gotten off 3 separate shots with his low-budget 6.5 millimeter Carcano rifle in the very quick timing of the shooting? How did the magic bullet go through both President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally? These questions, and several more of their type, you've heard over and over again. The Warren Commission, a group of politicos assigned by President Lyndon B. Johnson to officially investigate JFK's assassination, determined that Oswald acted alone. And the assassination was carried out via 3 bullets fired by him. The general consensus, however, is that the Warren Commission's findings were bogus for numerous reasons. Here are just a few examples. Kennedy was killed while riding in a convertible limousine down a Dallas street near Dealey Plaza. Oswald's shooting position at Dallas's School Book Depository building was behind the limousine. But the majority of witnesses interviewed by the Warren Commission said the shots came from the right front. Many testified that they saw unidentified armed men in the area. 3 Dallas police officers said they came upon multiple fake Secret Service agents. Others provided evidence to the commission that suggested a radio-coordinated assassination team was at Dealey Plaza. These type of discrepancies go on and on and on. No doubt, the Warren Commission's findings have been rebuked. And most intelligent observers realize that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone in assassinating John F. Kennedy. In 1979, even a Congressional House Select Committee found that JFK's assassination was very likely the product of a conspiracy. But why? At whose behest? There are, of course, numerous propagandized theories. Was it a conspiracy rooted in Cuban government sympathizers? Or the work of the mafia, the CIA? Or did Lyndon B. Johnson want Kennedy dead just so he could be the commander-in-chief? Were big corporate defense contractors behind the assassination because they wanted an escalation of the Vietnam War and Kennedy resisted? Or how about this theory? That it was the vengeful work of Richard Nixon. Perhaps, think about this, as all this battle over how Lee Harvey Oswald carried out the shooting and whether it was him alone or as part of one of these many conspiracy theories just been a smokescreen? To perhaps cover up the one true plot that is quite obvious when you consider the most basic of motives, greed valued in the trillions of dollars, and a plot, as we have revealed, that is steeped in the history of American presidential assassinations. Yes, it makes perfect sense that John F. Kennedy was executed for the same sinister reasons as his dead predecessors, Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, and William McKinley. For Kennedy took the money issuing power away from the centralized banking system of the Federal Reserve. In this big centralized bank scenario, a few of the potential co-conspirators identified in the various theories very likely could have been players along with Lee Harvey Oswald. Given that there surely was a coordinated effort at Dealey Plaza, who was part of the hit team? The Mafia? Maybe. The CIA? Also maybe. Cuban and other communist sympathizers? Another good maybe. After all, Lee Harvey Oswald had, a few years prior to the killing, defected to Russia. And his ties to Cuban interests became public knowledge. Could a conspiracy have gone all the way to the vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson? The ultimate presidential power is always a motive one can't ignore. And as we will see, Johnson did immediately do something after JFK's untimely death that inextricably linked him to the favoritism of the Federal Reserve banks. Now, as for Oswald, the Warren Commission did seem to get one thing right. When attempting to cite a motive for this man, they wrote,
Lee Harvey Oswald was perpetually discontented with the world around him. Long before the assassination, he expressed his hatred for American society and acted in protest against it.
In other words, Oswald was the perfect patsy choice. Much like the Garfield and McKinley assassins, he was a loner and loser, but one who was on the radar of powerful sources. Remember, the government was well aware of the discontent that Charles Guiteau had with President Garfield for not appointing him to a coveted ambassador position. And officials during President McKinley's presidency surely were well aware of Leon Charles-Gough's anarchist ties and the group's very public disassociation with him. While John Wilkes Booth was no loser, many of influence knew of his hatred of Abraham Lincoln. All these men, including quite saliently Lee Harvey Oswald, were easy to identify and recruit into a plot that could be sold to the public as disaffected gunmen who initiated their own plans to kill a president. But really, we know better. In each of these cases, there was a central group with that much more powerful motive, who had the resources to orchestrate true conspiracies using unwitting pawns in their strategic processes. Of course, this group was the centralized bankers. In John F. Kennedy's murder, this extremely likely culprit was very specifically the Federal Reserve, the central bank of his and our time. But what exactly did Kennedy do that so upset the Federal Reserve banks that would cause them to seek his quick removal? When John F. Kennedy narrowly defeated Richard Nixon in the 1960 presidential election, the Federal Reserve bankers were elated. Kennedy was the son of one of the most powerful and allegedly corrupt political backroom bosses, Joseph Kennedy. JFK's father had catapulted to mega economic prosperity through, among other things, high-level dealings in government and the financial industry. After many major banking successes and numerous purported high-level criminal acts, including a massive bootlegging operation during the Prohibition era, Joseph Kennedy was appointed by Franklin D. Roosevelt to be the first chairman of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. In referring to this appointment, FDR infamously declared,
I'm getting a crook to catch crooks.
A well-known historical account is that Joseph Kennedy was obsessed with getting his son the presidency. And a well-known telegraph from the elder Kennedy summed up his philosophy as he wrote,
Don't buy a single vote more than necessary. I'll be damned if I'm going to pay for a landslide.
Joseph Kennedy wanted the absolute power of the U.S. presidency in the family, but he also wanted to maintain the hundreds of millions of dollars that he had accumulated. May this be reminiscent of the thought processes embraced by the international central bankers? The banking cartel's twofold goal has forever been a mighty one: control the issuing of the money and obtain and retain the ultimate level of political power and financial wealth. No doubt, with the Kennedy family history in place, the Federal Reserve felt very comfortable with the election of John F. Kennedy. Business as usual would certainly persist under his presidency. But nay, JFK had other ideas. With the stroke of a pen on June 4th, 1963, President Kennedy signed Executive Order number 11110. This order gave the U.S. Treasury the power to, quote, issue silver certificates against any silver bullion, silver, or standard silver dollars in the Treasury. This meant that for every ounce of silver in the U.S. Treasury's vault, the government could issue new money into circulation. This was very bad news for the Federal Reserve banks. You see, JFK had ambitious plans to put a man on the moon, develop an internationally robust Peace Corps, fund a growing war in Vietnam, and further many social reforms in a manner that had never before been accomplished in America. To do so, he needed a lot of money. The Federal Reserve was willing to issue this money, but with big strings attached. They wanted billions of dollars in interest paid to them. Sound familiar? Sound like a dilemma that one Abraham Lincoln faced when he needed to fund the Civil War? And what did old Honest Abe do when the centralized bankers wanted 35% in interest paid to them? He sidestepped them and had the Treasury issue U.S. banknotes, specifically his greenbacks. What did Mr. Kennedy do? He also kicked the centralized bankers to the curb. When the Federal Reserve banks demanded their usual high interest rates, JFK instituted Executive Order number 11110, which allowed the U.S. Treasury to issue its own money, backed by silver. President Kennedy's action put the Federal Reserve's operations in serious jeopardy. JFK's silver certificate program, if carried out as planned, would have reduced the necessity to borrow Federal Reserve notes. If implemented faithfully, Executive Order number 11110 would have given the government the ability to do all of the things on JFK's agenda without paying interest on new Federal Reserve money. This obviously would have been a catastrophic financial disaster for these banks. So like Lincoln, who greatly diminished the wealth and power of the centralized bankers, Kennedy was a major obstacle for this cartel. And what better way to handle an obstacle than to remove it? In order for Executive Order 11110 to be eliminated, John F. Kennedy had to be eliminated. And on November 22nd, 1963, just 6 months after the president had signed this historic order, Kennedy was assassinated. After JFK's murder, no more silver certificates were issued. Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's successor, ignored Executive Order 11110. The Federal Reserve banking cartel maintained its monopoly to issue and control America's money, and no president since John F. Kennedy has sought to interfere with this exclusive power. The U.S. Treasury, the natural and logical choice to control and issue America's money, as it would save taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars yearly, is powerless in this regard. So do you think Lee Harvey Oswald hatched the plan to assassinate JFK and carried out the murder on his own? Or perhaps he had a little help from a friend, a very wealthy and powerful monster cartel of a friend. Abraham Lincoln's monetary policy, as codified in 1865 in U.S. Senate document number 23, provides,
Money is the creature of law, and the creation of the original issue of money should be maintained as the exclusive monopoly of national government.
of course, the Federal Reserve banks and their predecessor international centralized bankers couldn't have disagreed more with Lincoln's monetary policy, as well as those instituted by Garfield, McKinley, and most recently Kennedy. These policies caused massive monetary losses to the centralized bankers. Men who have wielded the greatest power in ensuring their stranglehold over the U.S. monetary system. Louis T. McFadden, a relentless congressman who often took on the Federal Reserve Banks as chairman of the House Banking Committee back in the 1930s, consistently explained that monetary issues shouldn't be partisan. He criticized both the Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt administrations. In describing the Federal Reserve, he remarked in the 1932 congressional record that,
"We have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. The Federal Reserve Board, a government board, has cheated the government of the United States and the people of the United States out of enough money to pay the national debt. The depredations and the inequities of the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks acting together have cost this country enough money to pay the national debt several times over. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States, has bankrupted itself, and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the maladministration of that law by which the Federal Reserve Board, and through the corrupt practices of the money vultures who control it."
Congressman McFadden additionally stated,
"Some people think the Federal Reserve Banks are United States government institutions. They are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign customers. Foreign and domestic speculators and swindlers, and rich and predatory moneylenders. In that dark crew of financial pirates, there are those who would cut a man's throat to get $1 out of his pocket. There are those who send money into states to buy votes to control our legislation. And there are those who maintain an international propaganda for the purpose of deceiving us and of wheedling us into the granting of new concessions which will permit them to cover up their past misdeeds and set again in motion their gigantic train of crime. Those 12 private credit monopolies were deceitfully and disloyally foisted upon this country by bankers who came here from Europe and who repaid us for our hospitality by undermining our American institutions."
John F. Kennedy understood this, and he tried to muscle out the Federal Reserve Banks, and thus there was quite a logical reason for his assassination. He took major money-issuing power away from this banking cartel and gave it back to the people of the United States. Then he was killed. The Federal Reserve Banks immediately got what they desperately wanted after President Kennedy's assassination. They once again unilaterally controlled the issuing of U.S. currency. They once again had a business that pays them, literally, over $500 billion annually through the interest they charge to American taxpayers for issuing our currency. Was this a good enough reason to launch a conspiracy to kill JFK? Is it just a coincidence that all 4 assassinated presidents, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and Kennedy, were also the only 4 presidents who disallowed the central bank's monopoly powers? Is it also just a coincidence that upon taking office, each vice president who assumed the commander-in-chief's post immediately repealed the decentralized banking orders and reinstituted the money-issuing powers to the central banks? I highly doubt it. History does have a way of repeating itself. And what has history definitively shown? The only 4 presidents who prevented the international banking cartels from having the sole power to issue and control U.S. currency are the only 4 presidents who were ever assassinated. Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John Kennedy all were murdered after taking action to have money issued by the U.S. Treasury, not through centralized international private banks. That is an undeniable fact.